I have just executed an unbirthday party with 25 screaming 5 and 6-year-olds, plus their younger siblings. I herded these 25 screaming 5 and 6-year-olds, plus their younger siblings, through 10 different superhero-themed activities. Obstacle courses, running up and down a hill, building things, arts and crafts, and no one was seriously injured. I have seen things you wouldn't believe. And now, the kindly neighbor has taken all the children out of my house for a few hours so that we could clean up and restore our sanity. I just want to sleep. And with sleep comes bedtime stories. But I can't sleep right now. And that's a bunch of BS. With S.A.C. When last we left off, William had chipped away at the sword of McFinn. Since he couldn't pull the sword from the stone, he just removed the stone from the sword and found that it was a sham. That McFinn was actually powerful himself and used the story of a magic sword as a diversion to make people underestimate him. Ollivander does not know this. Ollivander just knows that William has the sword of McFinn, and having just been called away back to the Laughing Raven on important business, is absolutely confident that McFinn's heir is totally ready to take on this entire kobold army all by himself. How could he not be? He has the amazing sword of McFinn. So, let's see what William is going to do now. Chapter 19. Home again. Things will be fine, William told himself. It's like Ollivander said, a hero always arrives precisely when he needs to, right at the last minute, right before the sacrifice, right before the torch is thrown. But you're hardly a hero, whispered Doubt. You've been lucky. Better lucky than skilled, William argued, repeating the old cliché. Everyone's luck runs out sometime. You'll need a lot to survive this. Do you think you have enough left in you? Maybe, he said, though he didn't believe it. But if Ollivander isn't here, it means it isn't the last minute, which means all is not lost yet. Sometimes a village must burn to let the hero know how grave the situation is. But Ollivander already knows how bad things are, so... Have you ever considered, said the sinister, nagging voice in the back of William's mind, that the reason heroes always show up on time is because when they don't, they aren't heroes, they're failures? That's not the way the world works. Failures. The conversation is over. William stopped talking to himself as he closed in on Barrow's End. He stood at a fork in the path maybe 2 miles from where the town should be. The travel post still stood, which was a good sign. He read it for luck. Barrow's End, not Barrowton, this way. Having never really left home before, he had always wondered why they felt the need to clarify on the sign. Barrowton was leagues and leagues distant. He knew better now. Barrow's End wasn't worth remembering. But damn anyone who says it's not worth saving, he said. His heart raced, though his steps dragged. It was an impossible village, both burned and prospering, until he followed the road around the bend and brought the sleepy hamlet into view, destroying one possible version and dragging the other into reality. This mask is itchy. As he drew close, he noticed the distinct lack of screaming, or the smell of smoke in the air. Always a good sign. Birds chirped. How bad could the situation be if birds still chirped? 100 yards up ahead, he could see where the trees broke. The village lay just beyond. He jogged ahead to the town square to let them know he was back. Charred walls and skeleton frames of burned-out buildings stopped him in his tracks. He smelled no smoke, because the flames had long since smoldered out. Probably before he even reached the Laughing Raven. The town lay in ruins. Ollivander was wrong. He was too late. The world he knew, the world he grew up in, planned his future around, planned to die in, was gone, vanished in a puff of smoke. At least it's not too late to die here, he joked, to hold back the tears. 1 out of 3 isn't bad, I suppose. The birds continued their cheerful song in the branches overhead. Stupid, indifferent birds. In his left hand, William readied his dagger, which he kept strapped to his leg, to make room for the 2 swords on his belt. He wished he knew how other heroes managed to carry 2 swords, a quarterstaff, a dagger, and a crossbow at once, not to mention their backpacks and bedrolls and rations. His handful of blades alone were bulky and awkward. His right hand drifted back and forth between the hilts of his 2 swords. Should he use the unintimidating quality of the scimitar, or the worthless but terrifying sword of McFinn? No sooner would he pull one blade out than he would have second thoughts and draw the other instead, which in turn pulled doubts out with it. A stranger could have mistaken him for an obsessive-compulsive, repeating his sword-drawing routine until his tic was satisfied. After much deliberation and weapon switching, William finally decided the whole thing was pointless, since he didn't want to be seen at all. Not yet, at least. Not until he saw the lay of the land, so to speak. What's the matter, baby? Oh, just hugging. And he knew what he faced. The dagger would suffice. William tucked into the bushes and crept quietly toward the town square. Dear heavens, he thought. But these magic boots are exceptional. Each step eased softly to the ground, slowly brushing aside any twigs or dry leaves that might alert kobolds to his presence. Squirrels wouldn't have noticed him. He could only hope that his enemy's senses were no sharper. As he approached the clearing, he lowered his hands to the soil and grabbed handfuls of earth, which he rubbed over his arms and face to camouflage. Drawing his head into a cluster of leaves, he peered through and surveyed the scene. Nothing stirred. The hustle and bustle of days gone by had vanished. Today was Friday. There should be a busy market packed with people haggling over the price of eggs or bread. There should be people enjoying a peaceful lunch on the lawn in front of the town hall. There should be a town hall, for that matter. Instead, the grassy square lay empty, desolate despite the green. Most recognizable landmarks, the tavern, the baker's shop, the blacksmith, were little more than piles of blackened wood and ashes. The few remaining timbers, those not torched to the earth, stood like matchsticks, or the bones of half-buried giants after the funeral pyre died out. A bear crossed the barren lawn unmolested. No town guard to drive him off. The beast's casual presence only made the land feel more lifeless. He watched the clearing for half an hour, hoping for some sign of life. Some survivor to come through, some sign of Sarah, or barring that, at least an indication that the kobolds might still be nearby. He had some vengeance to attend to. He held back his sobs as best he could. It would do no good to come so close, to have hidden so well only to be betrayed by a sniffle. He had almost given up hope when he saw Martin Baker staggering around from behind what remained of the tavern. He almost leapt from the bushes, calling out to his old neighbor, but stopped himself at the last second. It wasn't safe. Yeah, not safe. Martin wore shackles. A moment behind him, 2 kobolds armed with spears followed. One held the chain that kept the baker bound, while the other kept the point of his weapon within easy striking distance. They led their captive to the remnants of the smithy's shop and stood guard as he rooted through the soot and debris for scrap metal, no doubt for their own blacksmith to forge into more swords and armor. William felt the pit of his stomach drop as nausea washed over him. Vultures, scavengers, picking the bones clean. That's what these kobolds were. Disgusting, filthy carrion feeders living off the dead. Only common sense kept him from charging from the bush to make them taste his steel. Hey. Nuzzle, nuzzle, nuzzle. Martin wore chains. He was a prisoner, not a corpse. If they wanted to kill him, they would have. There could be other prisoners, too, other survivors. If he freed Martin now, he could save one, but he would have to find the others without alerting the kobolds to his presence. If the 2 guards failed to return, no doubt the rest of the army would send a search party. If he followed Martin and his captors, however, They would lead him back to the rest of the survivors. He could plan a breakout, preferably one that did not rely on him besting anything in combat. He watched and waited as Martin loaded his arms with tools and rods and other scraps of metal. When he looked as though he could carry no more, the kobolds barked orders in their rough little voices and nudged him back toward the trees. Following on tiptoes along the perimeter, he slipped into their trail several yards behind, keeping pace from the shadows and the branches of the forest that surrounded what had once been Barrow's End. They really did look like angry puppies, he realized. Ollivander had pointed it out to him what felt like years ago. But William couldn't see it at the time. He was too afraid, too troubled by the threat looming over his home for any sort of objective distance. Now, however, having faced more than his fair share of dangers, and having gained a modicum of experience dealing with fear, he could see them as they truly appeared, no more than 3.5 feet tall. Their fur-covered bodies barely showed over any decent-sized bush. Their ears either flopped or pointed depending on mood. Their small, wet button noses twitched when they looked around, and their tongues all but hung out of their mouths when they breathed. Tails wagged from beneath their leather tunics, bound with small belts holding child-sized weapons. Even their spears were barely longer than his arm. He wasn't sure if he should fight them to the death, or swat them on the nose with a rolled-up piece of paper and send them out into the yard, or offer them bits of bacon and rub their tummies and scratch behind their ears to encourage good behavior. It was hard to take a monster seriously once it reminded him of a childhood pet. The kobolds led Martin and, unbeknownst to them, William back to their camp. It had moved since he'd stumbled across it 3 weeks ago, but maintained the same organization, the same steady hum of activity. They seemed better equipped now. The blacksmith must have kept busy. Almost every kobold had some form of weapon in their hands, or strapped to their backs, or hanging from their waists. Martin dropped his load off at the blacksmith's forge and trudged back to a holding pen filled with a dozen or so shacks on the northern side of camp. At least 50 people roamed the pen's courtyard, with more probably lurking in the makeshift huts. He scanned their faces desperately. Hans the cartwright, Mariah the tanner. A familiar voice drew his attention to the center of the paddock, and he saw perhaps the first hopeful sign he'd had in weeks. A middle-aged man and woman, and 2 children hovering around a fire. He strained his eyes against the distance and glaring sun just to be sure. There, near the middle of the pen, he could make out his family. They looked tired, dirty, ragged. Their faces, especially his mother's, had grown gaunt, but at least they lived. At least they had their limbs and no visible wounds. He looked at the other prisoners, hoping to catch a glimpse of Sarah Miller, but couldn't find her and couldn't see anyone else close enough to ask. Shh. Please let her be in the huts. Guards patrolled the perimeter fence, which was tall by human standards, and flat out towered over the kobolds. They had constructed the fence using thick, tight netting, with gaps no larger than a couple of inches. Fingers could grip, but feet would be unable to support anyone attempting an escape. Scaling it quickly and quietly would be a nightmare, and they'd woven broken bits of glass into the fibers. Even if a person could get over without being noticed, the shards would cut them to shreds, and the net's ropes were too thick for someone to cut a hole large enough to fit through before being discovered by the guards. A small contingent of kobolds entered into the pen, and rounded up a few women and children, all of whom looked too weak to put up a fight or make a run for it. Prodding with their swords and spears, they ushered them out to the wide field that surrounded the paddock to help with laundry and to gather seeds and grain for food. His mother was among them. They had given her a small metal pot, presumably for whatever mushrooms and herbs she could find, which she set down in the center of an area marked off for her to scour for foodstuffs. You want a biscuit? Here you go. Have a bit of biscuit. He had to get her attention, had to find out what happened and what had become of Sarah. William silently gathered a handful of acorns and found a secluded vantage point that was close to the fence, but obscured by bushes. Where was I? Summoning his courage and a little strength, he threw an acorn toward his mother. He'd never been especially athletic, and 200 feet seemed a long distance to throw something so light with any accuracy. Still, he had a great deal of practice throwing attention-grabbing bits of debris in his short travels, far more than he would have guessed, and had improved his particularly narrow skill in no small degree. Even so, the acorn fell short. He considered standing to get a better throw, but decided not to risk it. She was far too far. He knew he couldn't reach her, but he could probably reach the pot nearby. He threw another, hoping the ping would grab her attention. The sound of acorn against metal rang out louder than he would have hoped, and a nearby kobold perked up its wolfen ears. Still, among the noise of dishes being washed and people milling about, the dogman's interest soon faded. His mother's, thankfully, did not. Hello? Okay, you're home. William pinged her pot again when they drew near, and once more to let her see where the acorns had come from. Glancing cautiously from side to side, his mother Marcella drew close to the tree line, peering as intently at the guards as she did into the bushes where he hid. "Who's there?" she whispered, once she had drawn close enough to the fence to avoid being overheard. "It's me, Mom. It's William," she almost shouted in surprise, only barely keeping her joy in check. In frantic whispers, she flooded him with questions. "Where have you been? What are you doing here? Aren't you afraid they'll catch you? Does anyone know what's happening here? Is anyone coming to save us? Does anyone care? Where did you get that sword? Is there anyone with you?" "I ran for help, just like the town council told me to, Mom," he said, trying his best to answer all her questions as quickly as possible. "I had help, but they had problems of their own to deal with. But don't worry, Mom, I'll take care of everything. Now, tell me what happened. Is everyone all right?" "They came the day you disappeared. They came at the farm out of nowhere, pulled us out. The horses caught fire in the attack. We hadn't seen you all day, so we thought they'd killed you. Oh, my baby, you're alive." "Yes," said William, and it dawned on him how true the statement was. All the scrapes and near-death encounters, and here he was, still alive. "It's been a long journey, but I'm alive, and I'm back to help. Now, tell me the rest. Maybe there's something I can use to save this place." She told him how they took them to the holding pen they'd constructed, how early in the evening they'd herded almost everyone else in barrows and back to the prisoners' field, as well as an hour later they'd noticed great billowing plumes of smoke to the south. That's when we heard you'd been to town, that you'd warned them, and that you ran for help. But then days passed and no one heard from you. William, your father, your brother, your sister, and I, we all thought you were dead." "I'm not," he said. "I'm here, and I'm going to find a way to save everyone. Don't worry." He hoped to convince her, but he hoped more to convince himself. They had an army. He had a trophy sword, beautiful but useless. "Tell me about Sarah," he asked. "Is she here? Is she safe?" "She's not here," she said. "No one's seen her. We think she—" His mother silenced herself and gave him a stare that sent him retreating into the shadows. A heartbeat later, he heard the barking tongue of a kobold ordering her away from the bushes. "I thought I heard a squirrel," she said, and shriveled before the wolf in boiled leather. "I thought I could lure it out, maybe catch it and eat it." The kobold loomed near the fence, peering intently into the bushes. William panicked. A creature like that would have a powerful nose on it. It would be able to smell that there was no... A squirrel darted down the tree and leapt to a patch of dirt barely a yard from where he had hid. He didn't dare breathe a sigh of relief, or relax even in the slightest degree, but in his mind he had done both, and thanked the gods his mother had always been a clever teller of tales. The kobold barked at her and swatted her back with the butt of his spear until she stepped away from the trees and returned to her work. The kobold sniffed the air a few times, gazed into the woods for a long moment, and then returned to his post. William let out a sigh of relief and immediately gasped for air. Holding in tension for a minute was one thing, and holding perfectly still burned his muscles, but he managed. Holding his breath for that long, however, was quite another. For one brief moment he allowed himself to relax, to let the fire that had built in his strained lungs and limbs fade. When he had recomposed himself, he surveyed the camp once more, counting guards and guessing the distance between towers, anything that might help him liberate his home. One of the kobolds turned sharply in his tracks and stared intently into the woods where William hid. He froze in place, nothing moving but his heart, which compensated for the stillness by pounding out a war cadence in his chest. Had he made a noise, shuffled some branch? He couldn't recall moving or taking any other action that would betray his position. As the guard moved toward him, he realized his mistake. A flash of light danced across the kobold's leather vest. The sword of McFinn, in all its beauty and splendor and polish, caught sunlight like a bear caught fish. The sword glinted, blinded the guard for a moment, and drew his attention to the mysterious light in the forest. Well, ain't that something? Not only is the sword of McFinn useless, it is, in fact, anti-useful, and it is creating problems for him. We'll have to see how he resolves this kobold tomorrow, though, because this one probably needs dinner, as is evidenced by the half a biscuit and the mysterious french fry you just saw him eat. Until next time, have good dreams.